What do you think about the Laker team now?
Do you follow the box scores of the games every day?
Just the Lakers.
You're kidding. That is really a compliment. I was pleased to see you smile at the top of our show because once the game starts, you have a game face. You don't smile much out there.
I don't think you have to do things for money anymore.
Correct.
What's up, Laker fans? Welcome to the Laker Film Room Podcast. I'm Pete, joined by Darius. And the last couple of weeks have seen three signings, D, at the vet min that have been kind of hard to watch from a Laker fan perspective. First was Gary Trent Jr. We did a pod on him. Then Spencer Dinwiddie. That was a tough one. Spencer wanted to come back, loved being a Laker, wanted to be here, goes to the Mavericks. And then finally, Tyus Jones signs with Phoenix. Really good signing for them for minimum. And so we talked a little bit about sort of the, what's the chess term? It's like zugzwang. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Where,
Yes,
it's like
yes.
basically it's, I don't know if that's the term, but basically it's a chess term where whatever move you make, you put yourself in a slightly more difficult position if you do make a move.
Yes.
And so the Lakers have sort of boxed themselves in to a certain extent with the player options for the vet mins and all that. And so we find ourselves with a very similar roster. And so I want to talk about sort of that class of players, D, today, of those guys, how much can they help? How much are the Lakers missing out on? And kind of if this is the roster to start opening night, which it looks increasingly likely that it will be, where's your head at?
As more and more signings happened towards the tail end of free agency, there was a list out there that was like, here are the best free agents left at each position. And I looked at that list and I'm just like, there's some good players on this list and players that could help the Lakers. Like Dinwiddie was still on that list. Trent was still on that list. Tyus Jones was still on that list. A player that's still not signed is a player like Markelle Fultz, who I think is a good player, and I like Fultz. I think players like that could help the Lakers. I also think that there's a couple of different things at play here in that the Lakers currently don't have an avenue towards a lot of playing time for any of those guys based off of the current construction of their roster. That said, those players are also more talented and more useful, I think, than some of the other guys who are currently on vet minimum contracts for the Lakers. And so if you were to ask me in a vacuum, Pete, would I prefer to have Gary Trent or Cam Reddish? I think that's a no-brainer to me. If you were to ask me even if I would trade big for small and say, like, would you rather have Tyus Jones over Christian Wood? Even though the Lakers have a logjam at guard already, I might say I want Tyus Jones because that then gives you an avenue to potentially move off of other guys on your roster and slot Jones in appropriately. But those guys are now off of the board, and maybe I'm overdue. We didn't hear Pete, and I've been lamenting about this a lot, but the Lakers are going into next season with 4 players who are either second-year players or rookies who are on guaranteed contracts. And in the LeBron AD era, now that's rare. When after the Lakers traded all of their young guys to get AD, they have mostly been using those sorts of roster spots on veteran minimum guys. And maybe this makes sense, right? The idea that Redick has talked about in player development and the harshness of the second apron and everything that goes with that. But the Lakers are also currently slotted to kind of have to rely on Max Christie and Dalton Connect as being 2 of their top 9 to 10 players. And that's also an uncertain world for a team that is used to relying on veterans, and veterans usually being the avenue for deep playoff runs. Especially a LeBron and AD led team. The team that won the title was chock full of veteran types dudes. And even the young players that they had were young veterans, right? They were older. Kuz was older. Caruso was older. KCP was on his second contract by that point. So I think the Lakers have been hurt a little bit, not by the amount of inactivity at the top of the roster necessarily, a D'Lo trade or a Gabe trade, something that can get them a top 8-ish guy back in return, but more so the logjam that's at the back end of the roster and their inability to churn appropriately at that part that would give them an avenue towards upping the overall talent level on the team. And I feel like it's hurt them some. And to what degree is one of the things I kind of wanted to hash out with you here, because we did a pod the other day talk about, will the Lakers go for it? And I think that the framing of that was like maybe a trade of those middle tier players.
Those top end, get a guy back. But this is the other end of the roster. Yeah,
but going for it doesn't always have to be, D'Lo and Rui and the guys who are in the $18 to $20 million range. Going for it could also be, what's happening in roster spots 9 through 12? Because in an 82 game season, those guys are important.
Yeah.
And we even saw the Lonnie Walker game rings in my head a little bit too, where one of those guys can win you a playoff game.
Yep.
And when you have to win 16 of those, one is super important to get one extra one of those.
It pays for their whole contract, right? If you can get a vet min guy or somewhere close to that to win you one playoff game, that makes the whole deal worth it, right? And so I think that a few things are at play here. I think the Lakers have 7 guys between D'Lo, Austin, Vando, LeBron, AD. Say that's the starting lineup. Gabe and Rui, that are those guys making 10 million plus, that are not just penciled, but kind of penned into the rotation. I think Gabe is a key figure in this too, in that a lot of the guys we're talking about, kind of the market inefficiency this year was at guard. You have Tyus Jones unexpectedly, not making as much as he has. Gary Trent Jr., Spencer Dinwiddie, right? But Gabe is the guy we signed for that spot. And I know that he had kind of a lost season last year, but when you're looking at basically, like when you talk about these guys, it's like, okay, whose playing time are they taking when they take that spot? And I think that one of the more intriguing ones was the Trent versus Max Christie type of thing, because I think Max is the guy that whose time he would have taken. And I think there's a certain amount of like, are we going to develop Max or not? Are we going to, we signed him? Is Trent marginally better at this point? Yeah, I think he is than Max, but like, are you Max also has a degree of upside to where, like, if you develop him, actually give him the minutes, he can be a different player even by the trade deadline. And that's part of my point too, is that you said that relying on Max and Connect is a big part of this season. And I think it is. I'm kind of optimistic, not just kind of, I'm actually very optimistic. I think they're good fits at the 2 and 3 spot, albeit young. But I would throw Gabe into that too. And so, like, I've wanted to talk to you about Gabe for a minute now, but kind of he had this lost season, man. How do you view him going into next season? We have all these wandering eyes for guards elsewhere and players elsewhere. Gabe's on the team and was signed to do the job of the backup point guard.
He was, and it's interesting to me because Gabe is, to me, the classic, I was an undrafted sort of second rounder type of player who made his way to a certain spot and then got a contract. Players like that, to me, can go in one of two directions. They can keep climbing up, and a perfect example of that is like Jalen Brunson. I think he's an extreme outlier of the ceiling on that sort of dude, but that's the trajectory of a guy like Gilbert Arenas was in that same vein, right? Where, you were a talent, but now you get to the league and suddenly you blossom. Or you can sort of revert back, like, I don't want to say turn back into a pumpkin, right? But
Sure.
You know what I mean.
I do.
Not necessarily was it real, but he got a ton of opportunity in order to be the player that he was, that earned the contract that he did. It took some injuries. It took some re-understanding of what Kyle Lowry was capable of and what they needed from a bench guard. And it turns out that Gabe was probably the better fit with the starting group in Miami in order for Lowry to take on the role that most suited him for that version of the Heat. And the fact is that Gabe Vincent starting point guard NBA Finals team is
Crazy.
what got him like an $11 million contract. He's not going to be Gabe Vincent starting point guard Los Angeles Lakers. The value proposition I would put back to you, and maybe we can dive into this a little bit more after break, is whether or not he is an $11 million player in the role that is assigned to him on the Lakers.
Let's take a break and talk about whether or not Gabe turned back into a pumpkin. So yeah, I do think that's a core question, D. It's also, though, one where if the answer is no, that he's not an $11 million player in that role. This other teams are going to be asking the same question when they trade for him, right? And so he's this salary ballast that we talk about in these trades, but he's not an expiring contract. He's got one more year left on his deal. And so from that type of standpoint, I think there is a certain amount of like, we need to make it work, at least as best as we can. And I certainly think it can. There were two parts of Gabe's season last year. First and foremost, I don't know if he was ever healthy, even when we signed him. Like, he got hurt very early. It was just a lost year and it never clicked for him, right? And so, yeah, physically he was out for most of the season. I would also argue that he is an organized basketball player. That's part of the reason why he thrived in Miami. And I do think that, there's some, I know that whenever a Miami free agent gets brought up, like Caleb Martin earlier, became an unrestricted free agent. People were like, no, don't you dare, Lakers. Cause he's a, cause he's a Miami Heat player that we're a little burned from Nunn and from Vincent. But I do think that there is something to being an organized player on a disorganized team, right? This is a core complaint that I had about last year's team. It was way too much roll the ball out there type of basketball that's not really what Vincent thrives in. And so to me, he's a key figure if we want to make these changes to the offense. In the past, he shot like 10% from three for us, right? But in the past, he's hit these threes off of Bam Adebayo handoffs and out of like 5-out type of style that I think is more similar to the type of offense that we'll be running. And so to me, Gabe is a huge figure in this too, because he's one of the guys, he can defend, right? I've got no questions about Gabe on the defensive end. And to me, that's a core principle of what this team can be, is they can be nasty on defense, and Gabe can be a part of that solution.
Well, think of who he was replacing. Gabe was actually the Dennis Schroeder replacement. And so he was the smaller guard who had a defensive mindset, so he could take some of the jitterbug sort of guards that maybe Vando's not best suited to defend, as a guy who scales down.
Yeah.
Right? And then if you're not necessarily slotting Max into that high level of a role, think back to preseason or the offseason last year, then you need a solution for that if you're not going to bring back Dennis. And Gabe checked a lot of those boxes. And then with the shift to 5-out, which was probably a conversation well before it was something that was in the media, Gabe's also a fit there. And so the upside of that, I think you're right in valuing Gabe appropriately within an environment that better suits him, right? And I think that is the avenue for him to be a solution next season. The thing that concerns me is a guy who was hurt the way that he was hurt last year, and the sort of knee issue that lingered and never really went away. And he was able to come back at the end of the season. He had surgery. Those are the sorts of things that concern me for year over year. Is it going to be a thing that crops up again next season? Like, oh, Gabe Vincent's out with knee soreness and tendonitis in his knee. And any rotation player that you're depending on, the way that the Lakers are currently slotting Gabe into a role where it's like you're a ball handler, particularly in a shift where you're already talking about taking LeBron off of the ball a little bit more and being a guy who you need defensively, who's going to play an important defensive role. That's where the questions I have about Gabe start to linger a little bit more. And I'm back into the idea of, even if Tyus Jones is not as good a defensive player, he might be the more reliable player overall. That then, if you're able to turn Gabe into a different type of role player that for a team that still has needs, then you get great value at one of these guard spots that now these guys signed for the minimum on another team. And the Lakers are, maybe not the Lakers front office, but fans and maybe me a little bit, are sort of like kicking ourselves. It's like, oh man, like, could they reorganize things a little bit better to give them the best shot imaginable next season?
I think so. Part of the problem is that Gabe's trade value is lower than it was a year ago, right? Because of the year that he had and because of the injury. And so because he isn't an expiring contract as well, I view him, Max, and Connect in a similar sense, strictly from an asset standpoint, in that they have a good chance, they have upside to be more valued by the trade deadline than they are now, right? Like Gabe Vincent's a good two-way guard that a lot of teams liked, right? Like he's a player that can slot into a lot of different types of styles and offenses and be a useful D&3 type of player, provided that he doesn't shoot 10% from three, right? But he was a solid player. And so after this season, trading him right now, you're not going to have a lower value on him really than you do now. And so because there isn't going to be that level of interest, there isn't a vacancy for a Tyus Jones, right? Like, I get your point about like, hey, we could rely on Jones a little bit more than Vincent, but if Vincent's still on the team, are you going to bench Vincent all the way? That's an awkward conversation, which isn't to say you can't have those, but I think there's a certain amount of like, are we going to create that dissension in the locker room for Tyus Jones, right? Are we going to do that for Gary Trent?
Well, it's an order of operations question,
Exactly.
right? Before we even started to record, we were talking about how the dominoes with those players who make $10 million or more, and this includes D'Lo or even a Rui, this player's not on the market now or whatever, but if there was a minimum forward and you're like, how is this guy still unsigned? He would be a great value, but you've still got Rui, you've still got Vando, and your two best players are LeBron James and Anthony Davis. Well, guess what? There's not a lot of forward minutes out there for the Lakers right now. And so would you try to sign that guy? Sure. Would that guy say to you, why am I going to sign with you for the minimum when
That's right.
There's no avenue for playing time? And so that order of operations hasn't happened yet. And these players can't sign on a whim.
Exactly. And so this isn't a back five of the roster question necessarily, right? This isn't Cam Reddish in the way to a player like that. It's like, no, you got 7 dudes in your rotation already slotted out, and I'm not a 5, which is one of the not vacancies, but you could compete with Hayes or Wood for playing time, right? But it's like, if I'm a guard and I'm looking at the Lakers roster, I'm like, okay, where are my minutes going to come from? Am I going to be able to, as a Tyus Jones, Gary Trent, even a Spencer Dinwiddie, be able to show the league, no, I can still really play and have a good year where I'm getting 25 plus minutes a game and then get that good contract in my 20s the next offseason, right? And so that to me it is that order of operations thing, but it's also like there's no vacancy for a lot of the jobs that these guys would be taking.
And this is why I wanted to sort of have this conversation with you, because I agree with you and it all makes sense. That said, I'm looking at roster spots 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and I'm like, well, if one of those top 9 players goes down, do you trust these dudes to step in? And you're shaking your head no right now.
All I'm saying is that Trent or Dinwiddie or any of them dudes aren't signing here to be just in case depth, right? Like, to me, this is a different problem that we're discussing. If your back 5 can't step into a game and just kind of keep it going along over the course of 82, that's a big problem, but it's a different problem than that's not one where an outside free agent's going to go, I can't wait to back up Max Christie, you know what I mean? And see if somebody goes down, then I go into the rotation, you know what I mean? So that's kind of the last issue there.
So I'm going to lead us into break with another question then.
Okay.
How disappointed on a scale of 1 to 10 would you be if there are no back end of the roster moves before the season starts, with the understanding that you're not deep enough necessarily to put out the quality of team that you want to put out there in those last few roster spots, while still understanding that, well, filling those spots is sort of difficult when you already do want your top 8 or 9 guys to actually play?
Let's take a break and talk about it. This is a yes and no for me, D. On one hand, I'm profoundly disappointed about the position that we're in. I think it's more, you could tell the story of how we are where we are over the course of several seasons, right? I think that to tell it well, that you'd have to do that. And so there is a certain amount of, crap, we got to get through this. This reminds me of a miniature version of 22 going into 23, where it was like, we knew we had to trade Russ, but we didn't trade Russ. And it's all like vet minimum signings. It's Juan Toscano Anderson and Lonnie Walker and Troy Brown and several guys who were helpful to the Lakers throughout the season, right? In smaller roles. but it wasn't the type of big move that needed to be made to move Russ because that wasn't the time to do it. I think it's a similar situation now that there does need to be a move, but or two, but now isn't the time to do it. But the difference is the back part of the roster being occupied by guys that can't play. To me, that's partly the domain of the scouting department. It's partly the domain of G League and South Bay, right? Is being able to provide those type of guys that can step in. And that to me, so for example, like our two-way contract strategy has been very muddled over the last several years, meaning that are you trying to develop guys? Are we trying to draft, or not draft, but undrafted free agent that's 20 years old that we like, right? Are we trying to develop them so that in 2-3 years they're able to help out in the big club? Or are we trying to sign guys like Skylar Mays, Dylan Windler, who are mid-20s type of players that are never going to – they don't have particularly high ceiling, but they've played in some NBA games, and if a guy gets hurt or some minutes pop up, yeah, they can pick up a shift here and there and be more competent than that 20-year-old can be. And so we've gone the 20-year-old type of route. We got all the – with Jalen Hood-Schifino, Maxwell Lewis, Bronny, but the development – like, where's the like, who have we developed over the last several years? I think Austin to a degree, but it's more of a reflection that we are not getting, and it's harder to get something out of the draft when we haven't had picks in this first half of the decade, or at least several of them. So I have some empathy there for sure. But to me, this part of the roster that we're concerned about, that sort of, hey, you can step in if somebody goes down to your main 8 type, is more a reflection of that than it is even the like player options and things like that.
It's interesting. I think it's 6 of one, a half a dozen of the other, sure. Honestly. It would have been great to have a Trace Jackson Davis to compete with a Jackson Hayes or a Christian Wood. And then if he pops, which he did for Golden State, but the Lakers could have drafted him too, that then you may be in a situation where they could have traded one of those dudes at the deadline last year, understanding that, hey, we've got a young center prospect on the team now. We don't necessarily need both of these guys, with the risk, quote unquote, of them picking up their player option next season. The flip side is, though, that you can't draft a Maxwell Lewis and expect him to be ready in year 2.
Exactly.
Even a Jalen Hood-Schifino, talk about a lost season. He needed back surgery as a 19/20-year-old rookie. He basically had a redshirt year. In a perfect world, he would have been able to step in for Gabe last year. Like, oh, Gabe Vincent's out. Here's a first-round rookie that we took in the 17th slot. And guys behind him who were drafted after him showed that he could play. So in an ideal world, Hood-Schifino shows something where it's just like, hey, we could maybe trade Vincent because we already feel like we've got that solution. Like, who cares about a Spencer Dinwiddie or Tyus Jones? We've got a 20-year-old guard prospect that's on this team that projects to be a defensive guy who could be an on-ball point guard and is a good passer and has floor vision and yada, yada, yada. And so that development piece that you're talking about is super important. That said, the guys who you do give player options to, you expect those guys to be able to play. Yeah. Like, it's one of the reasons why you give them a player option. It's because the chance of them popping almost eliminates the player option being a thing that you care about at all. Right. And so to me, it's not necessarily it is about the development of the young guys, but their trajectory, a player like Lewis or a Hood-Schifino, their trajectory is a 3 or a 4-year trajectory. And that's why they're on the contracts that they're on. Maxwell Lewis signed a 4-year contract. Jalen Hood-Schifino's rookie deal is inherently a 4-year deal. When I look at Hayes, Wood, and Reddish, I'm like, well, these dudes are veterans. Yeah, that's a professional player personnel scouting question about like, if you gave these guys 2-year deals, you better understand that they should be able to play in year 2. And like, I think in Cam's case, and in some cases Wood, I question whether or not they can play in this style of offense, a 5-out offense.
For sure. I'm more optimistic on Wood than Cam in that respect. But yeah, that's sort of why, as you were talking it out, I was like, yeah, no, the player options are killer. You can't be giving those out to guys that can't play, right? That can't. And to me, let me ask you this. What is your threshold for can versus can't play on a vetmin type of contract, right? Because these are I think setting expectations for what a good vetmin guy can do is important.
What is your NBA skill and how reliable is it? And so Cam Reddish, for example, he was so good in November and he was really good defensively, very disruptive on-ball player. He was getting a ton of deflections, a ton of steals, and you could see where his value was playing that specific style. But injuries slowly started to erode that athleticism that was so crucial to that part of his game. And then after that, he doesn't have that reliability as an offensive player.
Yeah, that's where it is.
Right? And so it's like, if you're going to be a vet min guy, you need to have a reliable skill that gives you a floor as an NBA player that's going to keep you out there. So this is one of the reasons why I talk about Jackson Hayes and why I sort of prefer him over Wood. It's because Hayes' athleticism is at a baseline level where I know as a guy who will run the floor and a guy who can get downhill, take one step, put his foot in the ground and elevate and play above the square. That is an NBA skill that he has. And that does not go away for him. So he will always be a roll threat and a lob threat just by being on the court. He will always be a guy who can thrive in transition because his motor is high enough where he's going to continue to run, particularly on offense. I look at a player like Wood and his NBA skill is his offense, right? But last year, his shooting was not there. He was very slow to get his shot off, and his comfort level as a 5-out player did not look the same as what his comfort level was in 4-out offense that he had shown in his earlier stops in his career. And so his floor then offensively became under the level in which I expect from Christian Wood. And so I thought his rebounding was good enough to stay on the floor, but his backline defense was not. So he then needed to be in very specific lineups in order to be successful. And in the end, it's just like, well, are you going to play Christian Wood or are you going to play Rui? Sure. And I'd rather play Rui, I guess.
I have a decent amount of grace for vet mins in terms of the lineups they fit into. I think that most of them are going to need kind of specific conditions in order to really thrive. But I do get your point on that. But my question is kind of going back to the Lewis and Hood-Schifino and all that is like, why are we drafting long-term on-ball players on a LeBron team? You know what I'm saying? Like, this is part of, I mentioned this several pods ago, but one of the biggest, and it's hard because we all want to blame one person, right? Rob Pelinka, right? Or Clutch or whoever, whatever villain, Genie, damn it, right? Whatever villain you want to pick. But this doesn't neatly kind of fall under one person's blame or not. But when the vision of the team is set by multiple people, for example, the draft being led by Jesse or the G League and two-way guys being led by Joey, that doesn't mean that Rob can't come in and be like, I'm the GM, but those dudes are owners, right? And those are their corners in terms of the Lakers organization. So of course you're going to let them lead the way and let them do their jobs, right? But if their mind is in a place of like, oh yeah, we're going to draft these young guys that are going to be ready by 2028, right? You know, or whenever they projected Jalen Hood-Schifino or Maxwell Lewis to be ready, then that's a very different timeline than one where you got LeBron and AD trying to go for it now. And those other rookies that you've talked about are examples of the Jaquez, the Pajemskis, are guys that would absolutely be helping this Lakers team right now this year and are more aligned with the timeline that we're on. This is part of the reason why I'm excited about Connect, is you watch him, you're like, that dude's good right now. It's not I can imagine it in 2 years. He can do what he does right now. And so I think that to me is one of, when I was talking earlier about like kind of how we got here and how I'm disappointed that we're here, that's part of it, is you've got multiple people kind of setting a vision and it's not always aligned toward a bigger goal.
So how worrisome is it to you then that this is what the back of the roster looks like for a team that wants to win the championship next season?
It's very worrisome to me that on a team that has the oldest player in the league and Anthony Davis, I think we've got, I think if we're healthy or have one, maybe two injuries, we're still a really good high-end team. But I think that we start getting, the floor is going to start falling out if certain guys, whether it's AD or just a couple of the wrong injuries, and I would argue we had that last year with Gabe and Vando, right? That was a crucial, your best and second best point of attack guy gone. Now figure it out on defense. Good luck.
Yeah, and this is where you brought up Troy Brown and Lonnie Walker as vet signings 2 summers ago. Those are the exact sorts of players that I'm looking for now, who I know have an NBA skill that is at the level that if you need them to come into a game, they can give you a shift or 2 shifts in a game where somebody is out and not be a detriment to your overall pathway towards winning that specific basketball game.
I view this same principle you're talking about from the flip side of the coin, right? You're talking about what's the thing that you do, like Cam Reddish. Okay, you can get over screens, pressure the ball, get deflections. What can you do? And I think that's always a very important question to ask. I also view this particular thing from the flip side of do you absolutely suck at something that's important? You know what I mean? Are you really bad at something that kind of cancels out the things that you are good at? And I think that happens a lot with vet mins.
I think it does too. And that's why the grace that you said that you show for them, I have that grace too, except when you live in this sort of ether zone that is only defined by me because it's my taste, is when you're not my kind of player, then you don't have to do much to sort of fall out.
To lose that grace, yeah.
I think of a guy like Lonnie, for example, and this is where I'll close from my point of view. A guy like Lonnie and a guy like Troy, they seemed very much eager to be professionals in that when their number got called, they were ready. And when their number got pushed lower in the pecking order, they did not mope or pout. And they were still engaged.
They stayed ready.
And so when we started the pod and we talked about a guy like Trent or a guy like Tyus Jones or Dinwiddie, those guys, I think, looked at the landscape and said, where's my avenue to playing time? This is important to me. I'm a 1-year vet minimum player, not a 2 or 3 or 4 year vet minimum player. So I understand why they may not want to sign up for a nebulous role that's ill-defined and not necessarily a clear pathway to the type of playing time that will get them back into the free agency mix a summer from now. But there's a class of player right below those guys, right? Which probably is the Lonnie Walkers of the world, the Troy Browns of the world, where if they've got to go in there and compete for playing time and let the chips fall, it feels like that's perfectly fine for them. And I think that they could play. And so that's the part where I'm like, man, it'd be nice to have a couple of those guys that you feel a little bit better about than needing to say, well, I hope that JHS is ready this season when he just might not be, or that Maxwell Lewis takes another big step forward over the next 4 months between now and October, where he shows that you could throw him into the mix for a 6-minute shift and he's going to hang and do his job. That feels like a lot to ask.
I don't
those guys right now. And that ask would feel lower to me if that was Lonnie Walker in their spot instead.
For sure. I also think that it took Lonnie Walker a little bit to get to that type of spot. And so that's part of, I think, pro personnel scouting. I was talking to somebody about this that kind of opened my eyes about it, is that really understanding the mental space that a player is in and where they're at in their career, what they're looking for is as important as anything. And so the different players are not always ready or in the same spot always as accepting of the, hey, I can stay ready and wait for my number to be called. And so that's all part of it. All right, this was fun. We'll be back tomorrow. I think we're going to take another trip down memory lane. If you want to support the work I do, you could do so on Patreon or buy me a coffee. We did a playback yesterday. Darius joined for the second part of it. It was a lot of fun. Watch Kobe drop 49. Going to do another one tomorrow. Team USA against South Sudan, a brilliant game last time they played. So come join me at noon Pacific time. But until tomorrow, you've been listening to Laker Film Room Podcast. We'll catch you guys next time.
James has got it in low to McHale. McHale wants to turn. He's double teamed. Just pass out in front. Broken up by Worthy. Tip to Magic. Worthy dies on his belly. Magic scores.
There's Magic got it. Magic fires. It's good. They will. Lakers win the game. The Lakers win the game. Rebound of Lonnie. 3 seconds left. Van Exel to win it. It's on the way. Good.
Kobe Bryant, 48 points, 16 rebounds. Shaq with his 8th block shot that ties an NBA Finals record.
A lot of Laker fans sticking around for this.
You're seeing something that's very rare indeed. A Laker to get MVP chance
in Boston. Of all places.
Are you kidding me?
Kobe, hard to believe.
Are you kidding me? Unreal. Are you kidding me?
Lakers looking to push. Bryant spinning in the lane. Back for Gasol. Pretty pass. And it's back to a 3-point game.
Kobe Bryant picked up by Bell.
There's the move. 2, 1.
Miss it.
Unbelievable. For the victory. It's over.
Shot clock now to 5. Bryant. Yes. And that was a little tap to Alvin Gentry.
Add insult to injury, Kobe. I mean, what a shot. I mean, you can't defend that. Are you kidding me?
2.1 seconds remaining. Denver a foul to give. Jokic trying to disrupt Rondo. He puts it in. Here's Davis, 4-3 in the win. Oh, it's good! Anthony Davis has won it for the Lakers! James again. Oh, he hits another one. LeBron James putting together a closing quarter against the Nuggets.
This historic 2020 NBA championship belongs to the Los Angeles Lakers. The Lakers conquer the bubble, and banner number 17 will soon hang in the rafters.